Episode 22, We Need a Plan. Before we start, as usual, please let me remind you that if you like the program, to leave us 5-star or review on Amazon or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This will go a long way to make sure that people who are interested in the program have access to it. So again, thank you. Today, we'll start at the beginning of 1953. Back then, France was basking in General Salon's success in Nassan. But Pierre Mendès France was still playing Cassandra. I've talked about Mendès France before, but since 1950, this French politician has been the only one who's been saying constantly that France had to enter in direct negotiations with Ho Chi Minh. In 1953, he said, for example, quote, "Our negotiating situation was better 2 years ago than last year. Better last year than now. It is probably not as bad now as it will be next year," end quote. And Mendès France was right. In 1950, France controlled the Chinese border but lost it during the Caobang debacle. Afterwards, with Delatte, the French briefly believed that they could save the day, but Delatte died. Salon evacuated Hoa Binh, allowing the DRV to control the whole area between its base in the Viet Bac in the far north and central Vietnam. And fast forward 1 year later, the DRV was in control of all northwest Vietnam and threatened to invade Laos. It therefore begs the question, why did France not rally to Mendès France's ideas in 1953, when it appeared that it was no longer able to win the war? Well, first of all, France could not just leave overnight and abandon its economic interests in Indochina. And you have to remember that the French colonial lobby exerted a lot of influence and had many supporters in Paris itself. Secondly, the party in power, and that is the MRP led by Georges Bidault, well, the MRP was still very firm on the issue of Indochina. As we said before, the MRP did not want to lose power to General de Gaulle, and they knew that as soon as they softened their position on Indochina, de Gaulle would pounce and remove them from power. And number 3, you have to consider the US position. The thing is that the US wanted to avoid at all costs a French evacuation of Indochina. So, the US poured in even more money, and the new Eisenhower administration increased the pressure on his French allies to continue the fight. And lastly, and this is me going on a limb here, I think that like the Americans in the 60s in Vietnam or in the 21st century Afghanistan, there is in every government at war the fear of bearing the shame of defeat. So even when the situation is bleak, governments come out with statistics that show victory is within reach, and they just need to push a little bit harder. And that's where France was in 1953. What about the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, as we've been saying? Well, all was not rosy either for Ho Chi Minh and his government. For starters, the People's Army has just been defeated in Nassan, and morale was not high in DRV areas. Think about it. The war has been going on for 7 years, and the peasants could not see the light at the end of the tunnel. At the same time, these same peasants had to provide more and more rice to keep the government afloat. The same peasants were drafted to transport everything that allowed the People's Army of Vietnam to fight hundreds of kilometers away from its own bases. These same peasants were also the infantrymen in the army, and they suffered tens of thousands of casualties in set-piece battles that General Zapp fought against the French. And you have to imagine that these peasant soldiers were fighting far from their lands, for example in the northwest Vietnam, and they were decimated by hunger, disease, French artillery, and US napalm. That's why, despite compulsory conscription, the DRV had to use coercion to meet their recruitment quotas. As we saw in the 18th episode, these huge sacrifices were not immediately rewarded. And it was to keep the peasants happy that the DRV began to persecute the landowners and to talk about land reform. And then from 1953 onwards, the DRV began to implement land reform. So in a nutshell, both the French and the DRV were in quite bad shape. With hindsight, the DRV had a slight edge on the French. They led on points if you were in boxing. But what they needed was a knockout as soon as possible because they did not have the legs to go to 12 rounds. So the People's Army of Vietnam went on the offensive again in April 1953. And they dealt France a massive blow when the Divisions 304 and 325 invaded Laos, an associated state of the French Union that was theoretically independent. So the DRV in April 1953 made the conflict even more international. Vietnamese troops entered Laos and stopped near the capital, Luang Prabang. Salon, the French general, reacted by peeling troops from Nha San, and he asked additional air support to save the Laotian capital that was almost encircled by the Vietnamese. Panic spread again in Paris, where everybody was like, here we go again, after Cao Bang and Jello. And panic also in Washington. President Eisenhower did not yet talk about dominoes falling, but he warned that if Laos was lost, the rest of East Asia risked being swallowed by the communists. In reality, what Giap had in mind was less ambitious. His first objective was to force General Salon to spread his troops even thinner. Secondly, he wanted to create real food depots and set up a political infrastructure in northern Laos just in case. And that's why, thanks to the Viet Minh, the Pathet Lao, this is the Laos counterpart of the Viet Minh, well, the Pathet Lao, led by Prince Suphanavong, was able to create a territorial base for his government in and around the town of Sam Nua. So everybody runs scared in Paris and Washington. But after, with the monsoon season looming, Giap withdrew his troops from Laos in May 1953. He just kept troops around Sam Nua province to protect his allies of the Pathet Lao. And it is not an exaggeration to say that this Viet Minh probe into Laos left everybody shaken. The Laotian king, Sisavang, the French himself, and the Americans. And just to be more precise, as I mentioned in passing, the 1952 elections in the US brought to power the Republican Eisenhower, World War II hero and a friend of the lad. Even though Eisenhower was a fierce anti-communist, his priority was to end the war in the Korean Peninsula, and therefore to negotiate with the North Koreans and the Chinese. That's what he promised during his presidential campaign. The consequence, though, is that he did not want to take a step backwards anywhere else. He was determined to stand his ground against the communists anywhere else than Korea. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, wanted ideally an independent, non-communist Vietnam. But the thing I forgot to tell you is that Bao Dai had appointed a new cabinet led by Nguyen Van Tam. And this new government had no popular base either. And Bao Dai was nowhere to be seen in Vietnam. So the US, seeing the situation on the ground, had no choice but to support the French colonial project. And by 1953, the Americans had already supplied 139,000 tons of equipment to France. We're talking vehicles, artillery pieces, all kinds of weapons, transmission equipment, etc. The new administration promised to do even more for France, but on one condition, that Paris put on the table clear and precise strategy to victory. And that was a problem, because what's happening in France at the same time is that French public opinion was not interested in the war in Indochina. And overall, people were just tired. Life was tough in post-war France, and people either were not interested or they thought that the government just had to stop pouring money over there. Especially because at this stage, France has suffered 90,000 casualties since 1945. So, faced with a more aggressive American administration, the new prime minister in France, this is a guy called Mayer. Mayer, with his foreign minister, Bidault, who hadn't moved, and with his minister for relations with the Associated States, Le Tourneau, well, they refused to increase the war effort even if the Americans asked for it. And Mayer, Bidault, and Le Tourneau traveled to Washington in 1953 to put their case to Eisenhower. When they arrived, the Americans reiterated that they were ready to give more money provided the French outlined a plan to win. Le Tourneau said to his American counterparts that victory was no longer possible in Indochina because of the risk of a Chinese intervention, just as in Korea. But Eisenhower was having none of that, and he kind of strong-armed the French Prime Minister in a private meeting. When that happened, the Prime Minister said, "Leave it with me, I'll get back to you." And what he did was he just went back up to the French delegation suite at the hotel and called in an urgent meeting. And then and there, at the hotel, the French delegation scrambled and came up with what was called the Le Tourneau plan. The Le Tourneau plan was a two-phase plan. In the first phase, thanks to US funding, the French would create new Vietnamese battalions to secure the pacified areas of southern and central Vietnam. That would allow French troops to focus on the north. After that, in the second phase, from 1955 onwards, the Franco-Vietnamese forces would go on the offensive and crush the Viet Minh forces. The Americans wanted a plan. Well, here it was. However, as you can guess, the plan had many shortcomings. Firstly, it required the Vietnamese army to step up, which was not a foregone conclusion. Secondly, the French acted as if they would be able to deploy their plan without Viet Minh attacks. Lastly, the plan carefully avoided the heart of the issue, which was the increasingly massive presence of the Viet Minh in the very heart of the Red River Delta. So clearly, the Le Tourneau plan was not realistic, and the Americans did not buy it either. But that was the only plan on the table. So the US had no other choice than to accept that it was what it was. And it was just afterwards, and after this meeting, that the DRV invaded Laos in April. And for Eisenhower, this was another proof of the incompetence of the French generals. He picked up the phone and said to the French that they needed to turn the situation around very quickly. Eisenhower made two demands. One, a guarantee that the Associated States would have full independence as soon as the war ended. And two, that the French appoint a new commander-in-chief, somebody à la Delarte, go on the offensive and win this thing. Well, the Mayer government was totally dependent on Washington, and they had their back to the wall. They weren't happy that the Americans pushed for a military solution in Vietnam, while at the same time negotiating a political agreement in Korea. But at the end of the day, the Americans had the money, so you had to listen to them. If American aid stopped overnight, the French soldiers would have no more ammunition. Inviting the Americans to Vietnam looked like a very good idea in 1949. But in 1953, it was a headache for the French leaders. Anyway, General Salon got the sack after the invasion of Laos. To replace him, Washington asked for General Valui to be recalled, but Paris refused because their Vietnamese nationalist allies did not like Valui at all. The other name that Prime Minister Meyer pulled off his hat was unknown to the Americans. General Navarre was until then commander of the French forces of NATO. And those of you who know where this story is going know that Navarre lost at Dien Bien Phu. But another area where American pressure had an impact was another important decision of the Meyer government in 1953. And this decision further demonstrated that the Associated States of Indochina were independent on paper only. In May 1953, the French government decided to devalue the piastre. Piastre was the currency in Indochina. So far, the Associated States have benefited from an artificially high rate of their currency. The piastre was valued at 17 francs until May 1953, when the French devalued it to 10 francs, but without any consultation with anybody in Hanoi, in Saigon, or in Phnom Penh, or in Vientiane. The French had very valid reasons to devalue the currency, because, as in many wars, there were all sorts of trafficking going on in Indochina, and there were thousands of war profiteers. The most lucrative of all the shenanigans going on in Saigon involved the piastre, the currency. And this is how it worked. Basically, if you bought $1 on the black market, it cost 350 francs. Remember, we invested 350 francs to buy $1. Then you sell that dollar at the normal rate of 50 piastres. Afterwards, you take your 50 piastres to the official bank and convert it into francs at the rate of 17 francs. So do the math. The initial investment was 350 francs. And what do you get at the end? 850. This is a profit of almost 150%. It was just too easy. As a result, there was widespread money laundering going on, and the whole Saigon and Hanoi was on it. It is rumored that how Bao Dai paid his lavish lifestyle, French and Vietnamese businessmen made the most of it, and politicians financed their campaigns with the traffic. And of course, the Viet Minh, the DRV, took advantage of it as well to buy arms and other material. And all that at the expense of the French taxpayer, which lost 500 million francs every day. American agents in Saigon were shocked by the prevalence of the trafficking. But it was tolerated by the French government until the French daily Le Monde exposed its working in a November 1952 article that caused a massive scandal in French public opinion. The government had to take action, and hence the unilateral decision to devalue the piastre by 40% without any consultation with the Vietnamese, the Cambodian, or the Laotians. And this devaluation had an immediate impact on the local economy. Everybody was outraged. Even the Vietnamese Prime Minister, Tam, who was the biggest French ally you could find in Indochina. Well, Mr. Tam denounced the decision and argued that this whole French Union thing needed to be reviewed. The non-communist Vietnamese nationalists became more vocal and sought support directly from the US. Our friend Godin Diem, for example, who was at that time in the United States, well, he came out of the bushes and demanded the revision of the treaties with France, the rejection of the French Union, and the establishment of a truly national government of Vietnam. So to sum it up, the devaluation of the piastre triggered political chaos in Indochina in mid-1953. And it was in the middle of this chaos, and after the invasion of Laos, that the 7th French commander was appointed. The military situation was desperate enough, and Paris was not sure what the best course of action was. And the reason was that the French politicians were between a rock and a hard place. The rock was that the American ally absolutely wanted French to stand firm. But on the other hand, there was no support for the war domestically. 3 examples. A poll in Le Monde in May 1953 showed that 2/3 of the French favored either a military withdrawal or a negotiation of an armistice with Ho Chi Minh. Secondly, a new high-profile political magazine called L'Express launched, and its front page of the first issue was an interview of Pierre Mendès France with the following words on the cover: "France can handle the truth." Mendès France was still pleading for negotiations in Indochina. And lastly, it is no coincidence that 2 books were published in 1953 that are still mandated readings today if you're interested in Vietnam. Histoire du Vietnam de 1940 à 1905 de Villers, and Vietnam, Sociologie d'une guerre by Paul Mus. These 2 books brought complexity to the debate about Indochina, and therefore implicitly showed that it was impossible to counter Vietnamese national sentiments with weapons only. So caught between the American hammer and the anvil of an unpopular war, the French government fell, and another political crisis set in where Mendès France narrowly missed becoming prime minister. Instead, an independent was elected, but Monsieur Bidault, who had been the foreign minister since 1947, stayed on his portfolio. Mendès France has warned the new government that the only alternative to negotiating with Ho Chi Minh was political disaster within 12 months. Would the government listen to him? Well, no. And with hindsight, it's amazing how prescient Pierre Mendès France was, because the road to Dien Bien Phu was now wide open. This is where we'll leave it today. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.